Okay, we would now like to switch and go into the second talk for the evening. And we are going to hear from the translator of the text that we will be resounding, titled The Transcendent State of Wisdom in 8,000 Lines Sutra. So we have the opportunity to hear from Professor Gregory Seton, and this is a really rare opportunity to actually get to meet, see, hear the translator of a text like this. And certainly, especially in the Tibetan tradition, translators are quite revered. So he is currently a senior lecturer in the religion department at Dartmouth College, where he has been for the past decade. He has a master's degrees from Naropa University and the University of California, Santa Barbara, and received his DPhil from Oxford University in South Asian and Tibetan Buddhist studies. In addition to his vast academic work, he has been a practitioner of Buddhism for over 30 years and founded a nonprofit organization to provide an intensive online meditation curriculum free of charge. So let's welcome Dr. Gregory Seton.
First of all, I would like to thank Venerable Thupten Chodron and Sravasti Abbey not only for inviting me here to speak in this incredibly beautiful temple at this wonderful place, but for actually putting on this resounding. It's incredible. You say it's rare to have the translator speak when you're doing the resounding. It's impossible to find a translator who has stood there and watched his words be resounded. It's very humbling and wonderful, and they're not my words, of course. They're the words of the Buddha, but I did a lot of work trying to translate them, which is not always easy, and I should say took quite a bit of effort over many, many years to get it right, and I'm not sure it is right, but I'll talk to you a little bit about that today and what the process looked like. As a scholar, I studied both Tibetan and Sanskrit, and I found the Sanskrit language to be an incredibly powerful and interesting language. The way it's constructed is very difficult to describe to other people, but it's a language that you can really see through to the bottom in every word and everything that you see on the page. It's so deep. The language itself is so rich, and it has so many connections. It makes the challenge of translating extremely difficult. There's just so much there. Imagine translating jokes into another language. It doesn't really play all the time, right? So in the translation of this text here, I felt incredibly difficult burden because there are jokes throughout this scripture, if you will. There's plays on words left and right, and almost everything that you would imagine would be difficult for a translator was in this scripture, as far as I could be, as far as I'm concerned. But I'd like to just talk first a little bit about the two traditional approaches to the scripture, and you've already mentioned them both in your talk. And that is the approach of reciting and approaching the text with devotion and faith. And the scripture itself talks quite a bit about this. It says that you can just venerate the text, listen to it, read it, and recite it, and wonderful benefits will come. The second approach is more for the reason-oriented types, it says, and they can study the esoteric reasoning behind the text through the outline called the Abhisamayalankara, also known as the Ornament of Clear Realization. And this is a very long commentarial tradition on the meaning of the text, and it's extremely profound and wonderful to read. It has 1,200 subpoints, 1,200 points and subpoints. And those points contain long lists of other things. And you would be shocked to see what's in this as a starting point to understand this text. If I have to memorize all of that and know all of that and then read the text, how am I ever going to get to the meaning? So I myself have tried a little bit here and there to understand it, and I can't claim any great understanding of the Abhisamayalankara, but having studied it, I've found it incredibly helpful and useful for understanding how to translate as well as read this text. I'll try to speak first. Rather than summarize everything, I'll just focus on explaining the term, translated here, the Transcendent State of Wisdom, and then I'll try and connect it to the central message of the scripture. And this way of explaining, starting with just the term, is actually a long tradition. The Indian commentators, there are two of them. There are Haribhadra and Ratnakara Shanti are the two commentators on this scripture who wrote wonderful commentaries. And they focused quite a lot on this term and wanted to talk about it in depth. And just understanding the term, they said, was a way of understanding the entire scripture. And it is the title term. So if we open it up a little bit, perhaps that will be useful for everyone going through. You'll be saying it a lot, I promise you. Nice to know what it might mean. So I'll begin with the etymology of the term, and this is a very technical discussion, and please don't get lost in this. It's not intended to be all about Sanskrit, but there are some things, signposts that I can give you for those who know a little bit about it and are wondering and have read something somewhere else. If I'm not accurate here, then you'll walk away thinking something quite different. So I'll just be reciting some of the Sanskrit so that you understand the etymology of the term, Prajñāpāramitā. And that etymology comes from a tradition in Sanskrit, as I was mentioning before, where words are not seen the way we see words. So etymologies in our language, English, we'll think, oh, what is the historical derivation of that term? How did that term come from the Old French or the Old Saxon into our language? And we understand the history of that term in etymology and say, oh, it used to mean this, but now it means that. Very often Westerners would like to treat etymologies this way, but if you get into the Sanskrit tradition, the Indian tradition of discussing this sutra, you see very quickly that etymology is not about that. Etymology is a teaching device. It's a way of clarifying, and the Sanskrit language particularly lends itself to being opened up in this way. And that opening is incredible, the way it's done. A master commentator should be able to open up terms to give clarifications in deep understandings of the terms. So Prajñāpāramitā is the term that we're going to talk about, and most people have heard this, and that term can be understood in very different ways. The word paramita is the one we'll focus on first here, paramita. And if you look at the grammarians, generally, if we take it more from a Western Western etymological perspective, that term paramita probably comes from this word parama. Parama, you might know the word parama, like paramartha, ultimate truth or absolute truth. Parama. Probably comes from parama, and that gets formed into a feminine noun. So parama is an adjective. It can mean furthest or highest or most distant. Parama goes to parami in the way that the language works, and then you add this ta at the end, which is the abstract suffix, meaning something like state, the state of. So the state that is the highest or the furthest is this first etymology of paramita, and this one is often favored by grammarians who are just talking about the history of the term. So paramita, the furthest state, the highest state. And this is how Edward Conze and others have come to this idea of perfection. Okay, perfection, using this. But when you read the commentators, the most authoritative commentator on this is Haribhadra, and he clarifies that understanding of paramita should be understood in a different way, and he does this through this, what you can call heuristic etymology, which has come to be known in the West in other forms. He clarifies that it should be param, so that's instead of parami plus ta, it's param plus ihi plus ta. But in Sanskrit grammar, This is a little bit unusual, but it's part of the tradition of heuristic etymologies. And what that breaks down to is param means to the far shore. Ihi means a goer, someone who goes to the far shore. And ta, once again, is this abstract suffix, the state of. So if you put it all together, it means the state of someone who goes to the far shore. And that's what the meaning of the term is. He is very familiar, Haribhadra is very familiar with Sanskrit grammar and knows about the Padamapadamihi plus ta. And in certain cases, that might be applicable and a nice way to talk about the term. But he puts tons of effort into talking about it in these terms, and we shouldn't ignore that. Okay. If you ask, to what far shore does that someone go? Well, the tradition replies, to the far shore of the ocean of cyclic existence. Okay? So this is where the idea of transcending comes. Okay? You're transcending the ocean of cyclic existence by reaching the far shore. And that's built into the tradition, that understanding, samsara as an ocean, and the far shore as some kind of respite from that ocean. And that's built into this term as well. Just a side note to say, some people have regarded this as a very fanciful etymology that Haribhadra gave for the term. And this is a kind of, I don't want to say bad Western habit of discounting people, but yeah, sort of a colonial thing, saying it's fanciful. In fact, there is a very well-established term, paramgata, which is the same thing, and we know it from gate. Parasamgate, okay. So there's a form of that called paramgata, which does the same thing and is well established. Okay, so what is the point of me telling you this etymology? Because we're going to be talking about the term in a deeper way, and I think it's really helpful to kind of get a fix on what it's saying. If we take this idea of going to the far shore, we can translate, you can at least begin to understand why it's translated as the transcendent state. Because it's the state of someone who goes to the far shore or reaches the far shore. And what is it the far shore of? We said, in a sense, it's the ocean of cyclic existence. But in this case, Prajñāpāramitā is saying that wisdom, it is the far shore of wisdom that accurately discerns the nature of all things. And if we expand on this terminological metaphor of the ocean, we could say that ordinary beings are suffering helplessly, drowning in the middle of an ocean. By studying, contemplating, and cultivating wisdom, the three steps in wisdom, according to the Buddha's different teachings, ordinary beings can learn to swim across that ocean to its far shore. When beings reach the other shore, they transcend the suffering of cyclic existence, and they reach that transcendent state of wisdom that belongs to the noble ones. Okay. Now, here, noble ones, if you're not familiar with the term, is a very specific term referring to people, four types of noble ones usually. Arhats, if you're familiar with the term, of course, arhats, Pratyeka Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and Buddhas. And these noble ones, all, according to the Abhisamayalankara, all have the transcendent state of wisdom. But they have it to varying degrees, we could say. Okay, it doesn't state it this way, but that's the upshot. In the homage verse for the ornament of clear realization, it says, this transcendent state of wisdom is personified as the mother of the awakened ones. Because in this definition that I gave you, that which sees emptiness, the mother of the awakened ones is transcendent state of wisdom, the seeing of emptiness. That is what gives birth to the four types of noble ones. So this is the praise of Prajñāpāramitā is because this transcendent wisdom is what produces these people, the noble ones who have transcended samsara. It is through that they get there. Now, this is a metaphorical verse, and it says that she is what brings peace. I'm going to paraphrase here rather than do the whole verse. She is what brings peace. She is what brings the peace-seeking Shravakas to the state of Arhats, state of Pratyeka Buddhas. She is also what causes the Bodhisattvas striving for Buddhahood to be able to benefit the world. Without this transcendent state of wisdom, they wouldn't be able to benefit the world. And she is what enables the Buddhas to express their absolute awareness of everything. Now, even though that might make it sound as though it's referring to a single thing, the transcendent state of wisdom that does this, that is metaphorical, and we should understand the difference between the degrees of noble ones based on the degree to which they see emptiness. So the Arhats and Pratyeka Buddhas say they can achieve peace because their transcendent state of wisdom sees, and here we put it as you put it before, well, maybe a little bit different language, sees only the emptiness of personal identity, this I who's at the center of the universe. Okay? So Arhats and Pratyeka Buddhas achieve this transcendent state by seeing through the personal identity, and this is called Pudgala Nairatmya, the emptiness of personal identity. The Bodhisattvas, for their part, they're able to benefit beings because their transcendent state of wisdom sees both the emptiness of personal identity and, to varying degrees on the different bhumis as they go, the emptiness of the identity of all things. So their transcendent state sees the twofold emptiness, as it's sometimes called, whereas the Arhats and Pratyeka Buddhas see only one half of that. But still, that one half is enough to transcend samsara. Finally, the Buddhas can express their absolute awareness of everything because the transcendent state of wisdom sees emptiness in its entirety, means that they have a complete and different type of transcendent wisdom. So each one of these possesses a state of awareness that is transcendent to a different degree, and I want to sort of get to explaining in a very precise way what this term in each case is referring to, but I will focus here for a moment on the bodhisattvas because it's a little bit easier to talk about them, and to get into the details of each one would be probably too much for this occasion. So Ratnakara Shanti says that the term transcendent state of wisdom refers to two types. There are two applications of the term. And we could say one has to do with the bodhisattva when they're in meditation, and one when they're out of meditation. So in both cases, the bodhisattva has the transcendent state of wisdom, but they're different types of transcendent wisdom. In the meditative state, a bodhisattva has what they call the Lokottara Jnana. Lokottara Jnana means, literally, it will have to translate it the same way, means transcendent awareness or transcendent gnosis, if you prefer that term. Transcendent knowledge, another way of talking about it. Lokottara, loka means the world, and uttara means going beyond or beyond the world. So literally, the gloss of this term is Lokottara Jnana. That is the primary referent to which the term transcendent state of wisdom refers. In this way, Lokottara Jnana, which is the stated primary referent, is when the bodhisattva in their meditation sees emptiness directly without any mental constructs. And that seeing directly of emptiness without any mental constructs is this Lokottara Jnana, this transcendent awareness. But when they get up from that meditation and they go about trying to help beings throughout the world, they have something else that's called Shuddha Laukika Jnana. Shuddha means purified, and Laukika means worldly. It's a worldly awareness, very similar to our own awareness, but the commentators clarified that it's not our awareness. It's not this ordinary awareness that we have. It's been purified. It's been made, if you will, transcendent by the seeing of emptiness in meditation. And it extends to the period afterward. But it's not the same. They differentiate this, and they do this very specifically to say that the bodhisattva must work through the path at bringing together these two, the transcendent awareness they have in meditation and that purified worldly awareness that's out of meditation, so that those two can merge and be fully transcendent, not just the purified ordinary awareness, fully transcendent. And that happens at the point of Buddhahood when the non-dual awareness arises. Okay? So if you understand that transcendent state of wisdom refers to a transcendent awareness that also has a referent in the ordinary awareness, but only insofar as when the bodhisattva is in the world, he is able to transcend the world. He's in the world, but not of the world, in a sense. So if we want to expand our metaphor, we can put this into the swimming metaphor and say, when beings reach the other shore of the ocean and they transcend the suffering of cyclic existence, and they reach that transcendent state, the Shravakas find peace and tranquility like resting on the shore of an island. So they get to this far shore, and they climb up on that island, and that's the transcendent state. That's what they understood, and that's what they have gotten to. A place where you can rest, outside of the ocean. So for the Shravakas, the island is the transcendent state. It's kind of like the idea that when you leave existence, you're no longer reborn. You go to nirvana. This is the Shravaka idea of peace in nirvana. And that is precisely the way that the transcendent state is understood for Shravakas. But the noble bodhisattvas, out of their compassion, they don't want to stay on that shore and just attain nirvana for themselves. And they do not regard that as the transcendent state. So they dive back in the water like lifeguards, going out to save all sentient beings one by themselves over 3 countless eons. So what is going on here is that for the bodhisattva, the transcendent state doesn't refer just to being on this island. That's where the transcendent state involves, yes, the meditative transcendent awareness where they sort of recharge their batteries, and then they go out and save more beings, and they come back and recharge their batteries, and then go out and save more beings. So as a lifeguard sort of sitting on the shore, if you will, that's in the meditative state that we just discussed. That's the transcendent state of wisdom that they're experiencing there. But when they're going out and saving all beings, it's not just to save beings, it's also to become a Buddha. They're doing that not just for their own helping of beings and to say, I save the beings, but they want to come to the point of being a Buddha. And so they swim and they swim and they get better at swimming. And we'll jump ahead here for a moment and say, what is a Buddha in this model of transcendence? What is the Buddha's transcendent state? Because we've talked about 2 others. Well, the Buddha's transcendent state is like a glowing and wonderful being who's just totally at ease in that ocean, floating without any need to move, effortless, natural, floating. You see, that is the full manifestation of the non-dual awareness, the transcendent state of wisdom that the Buddha has. For the bodhisattva going back and forth, the ocean is not a place of suffering for himself or herself, but it is a place of suffering. Still, to some degree, it is a place of suffering. Thank you. And so there's this back and forth for the bodhisattva, working all the way up the bhumis to the point where in the higher bhumis, they start to learn to float. And that's what the real transcendent state of a Buddha is like. Now, when you come to this point where you're learning to float, you might say, hey, when we were drowning in the ocean, why didn't you teach us how to float right away? Why did we have to go through all this swimming and get to the island and then go back and forth and go back and forth? And the answer would be very sort of funny if we could overhear the conversation. Well, it's because when you were drowning, you were too fearful and resistant to learn. Okay, so the later tradition, let's say the Buddha nature tradition or the Tathagata Garbha tradition might say, everybody has this natural capacity to float. We just don't realize it. Right? We just don't realize it. It's within us to have that same transcendence as a Buddha, but we don't realize it. This scripture is not talking about that. This scripture is saying that you have to do all these things. You have to swim, you have to go here, you have to go there, and you have to do this. But how you do that and what you do it for is so that you can develop the confidence in the water that is necessary to be able to learn to float. That's a very high accomplishment. Only if you're telling me to float, I'll be like, you go down. When you're sinking, if your body is sinking, you start moving your arms. But a bodhisattva who's so accomplished as a swimmer and a lifeguard is somebody who can learn to float quite easily because they don't have that fear. They can just relax into careless ease and discover what floating in that transcendent state is like. Okay, so when we're talking about transcendent states, the three transcendent states, the island actually functions for both Shravaka types, the Shravaka and the Pratyeka Buddhas. The other transcendence described for the Bodhisattva, they don't abide in the ocean, they don't abide in samsara, they don't abide on the island. In that way, they don't see samsara and nirvana as two. They transcend both, samsara and nirvana, not abiding, not resting, not dwelling, constantly moving through the 6 paramitas. But when we talk about the Buddha, qualitatively, that transcendent state is totally different. Totally different from the other two. Floating in the ocean. So you see, when we're talking in terms of the transcendent state of wisdom, the idea that this is one transcendent state, no, there's the seeing of emptiness is defined as the transcendent state if you're talking about what is the defining characteristic. But if you're talking about what that looks like on the path to Buddhahood, that transcendent state looks different at each different stage, and this is what the entire text of the Abhisamayalankara, the Ornament of Clear Realization, is there to explain. And it explains it a little bit like I'm saying, but not with the big metaphor. That's my own metaphor. But I've worked on this and thought about this based on my studies of the ornament so that I could explain it more simply in a term that is more visual and you can understand easily. But I want to say this because this is the study approach. The study approach is understanding something about this word. What does this word mean? And what is this title? But when you get to the scripture, you're not going to see all of these swimming metaphors. There's going to be a whole lot else that goes on. So we better get to what the scripture actually says. This is the underlying structure that helps, if you know this, to not get totally lost. I can't promise you won't get totally lost. Okay. There is in the scripture, excuse me, my voice is kind of going. There is in the scripture this comparative message. And this comparative message is, if I try to put it in a simple way, This is called the Transcendent State of Wisdom. That's the title. And if you will, the scripture, thank you. I don't know that will help. And the scripture is going to be comparing these, primarily the Shravaka notion of the transcendent state of wisdom, with the Bodhisattva's notion of the transcendent state of wisdom. That's the real crux of the comparison. But that is not told in a very sort of direct manner. And I'll talk about that in a moment. It's not explicitly told to you, but it's assumed in the structure of the text itself. So let me just talk a little bit about the way the text is organized and show you how this structure works. So many scriptures begin with a disciple's question that is answered by the Buddha. But this scripture begins with Buddha making a request of Subhuti. And he says to Subhuti, please illuminate. Basically, you can see this in the sutra. I won't do the phrase exactly. Please illuminate for the bodhisattvas how they begin with this transcendent state of wisdom and then realize the transcendent state of wisdom of a Buddha. And it specifically says, and they go beyond cyclic existence, which is to say, tell us how bodhisattvas go beyond cyclic existence, get out of the ocean of samsara in this transcendent state of wisdom. And that opener then is followed by the rest of the scripture, which answers it. And basically, the rest of the scripture teaches that the way, if we boil it down, okay, this is a big boil down, but the way that bodhisattvas go about life in the transcendent state of wisdom is how they transcend it. In previous translations, you might remember Kōnsa being mentioned by Venerable here. Difficult to read. Kōnsa had translated this phrase that I translate, going about life in the transcendent state of wisdom, which is basically what a bodhisattva is recommended to do. Kōnsa translated this coursing in perfect wisdom. And he was an excellent scholar and a pioneer, a German man with certain personality flaws that included a great deal of anti-Semitism and other strange things. And I don't want to tear down his translation and his tradition entirely, but what we know about him now sheds a lot of light on his attitudes and the way he took this. That phrase, coursing in perfect wisdom, or coursing in the perfection of wisdom, simultaneously oversimplifies the transcendent state of wisdom into just this perfection, and it mystifies the entire process simultaneously by talking about coursing in it. Now, I don't want to sort of move in the direction of conflict here, but in this wonderful occasion, but what I want you to imagine, and you're going to be saying this over and over in this sutra, is what does it mean to go about life in the transcendent state of wisdom? And how central is that? Wouldn't anybody want to know what that is? Yeah. So the difference between the transcendent state of wisdom of arhats we've already described, how does a bodhisattva do this? And that's what you're supposed to be learning from this scripture. But unfortunately, the scripture is complicated. And if you try to find a way to say anything about the scripture, your tongue falls out and bounces across the floor and disappears. So I will just say that the way that it is structured, particularly around a conversation, around a dialogue, this is not uncommon in sutras, is something very helpful for understanding what's going on, okay? So to appreciate this scripture, if you know that after Buddha asked Subhuti to illuminate how the bodhisattvas go beyond cyclic existence in the transcendent state of wisdom, that this dialogue between Subhuti and his interlocutors, his conversation partners, is very loaded. Okay, we can call it loaded or encoded. In the first chapter in particular, Subhuti has a conversation partner in Shariputra. And Subhuti, among the Buddha's disciples, is known as being the foremost among those who have become free of conflict. That's the way they describe it. Tibetan tradition interprets this to mean free of negative emotions, free of the kleshas. But the literal term is free of conflict. We could think of it as he's the most open-hearted person. And his initial conversation partner, Shariputra, is reputed to be the most intelligent arhat, okay? The most intelligent. And he's also known to be the one who created the Abhidharma tradition. Shariputra. That's who he's talking to here. So to ancient readers, it would have been very obvious that Shariputra was representing, to some extent, the Abhidharma tradition or the Shravaka path. And Subhuti is representing, in a way, the Bodhisattva path. Okay? And the conversation between them is basically Shariputra is trying to get Subhuti to nail things down in an Abhidharma kind of ontological, metaphysical way. Say, this is what it is. Let's be clear about this. Let's put this in an understandable form. What is this transcendent state of wisdom of the bodhisattvas? And how is it different from ours, so to speak? So when this dialogue is going on, they don't tell you this in the scripture. I'm telling you this now. This is a hint, okay? This is a hint that we're having a problem of communication here between them. And what happens throughout the scripture is that, is that Subhuti just avoids over and over Shariputra's attempt to pin him down. It's not like he's doing backflips. He's just coming from a different logic. He's standing in a different transcendent state of wisdom. And that he's standing in because the Buddha empowered him and various other things happened in the beginning of the sutra, which you'll read about. But he's able to stand in that state and speak from that state, and that just doesn't get tied in knots. So in a way, you can understand not just what Shariputra says as coming from the Abhidharma tradition, and not just what Subhuti says as coming from this Bodhisattva tradition, the content of what they say, but also what happens in the course of the conversation. You understand? It's performative in one sense, and we'll talk about the scripture itself. Scripture has two basic ways of communicating. One is the esoteric part of the scripture, which we talked a little bit about with the ornament of clear realization. They make that esoteric part clear, explicit, what is implicit in the scripture, which is not said at all anywhere. They make that clear. But there's this performative aspect of the scripture, which is that you're watching two transcendent states of wisdom confer, and you're seeing how they relate, okay? It helps, okay? Maybe I'm overshooting with that a little bit, but I think that that's pretty close to the way at least the first chapter goes. And then there's other conversations, and they unfold, and you'll see them as they do. But if you're tuned into this fact, you'll understand many of the other things about this performativity in this scripture. So I had previously said that the word transcendent state of wisdom refers is something possessed by the Four Noble Ones. It is also the case that that word is used throughout the scripture, not multiple times, but here and there, to refer to other things besides them. And I want to just give you a little bit of a heads up. For instance, the scripture refers to itself as the transcendent state of wisdom without telling you that it's talking about. So you make offerings to the transcendent state of wisdom. What do they mean? Offerings that are laid out here on the shrine to the book itself. This self-referential way that the scripture is talking about itself is part of the performativity of this. And performativity is a big word. It includes a lot of things, and I want all of them, so I got to keep the word. But what goes on in this scripture is they are enacting what they're saying. They are enacting what they are talking about, as I've already told you. They are enacting that. And that's one level of performativity. Another level is that when you read this scripture, and it recommends throughout, as you've already heard, maybe from other sources, it tells you what you need to do with this very scripture is you need to give offerings to it, venerate it, recite it, read it aloud, do all these things. You need to perform these things with respect to this very scripture that you are reading. That adds another level of performativity. Okay, so you need to perform those things. And as you're performing, the question is, in what state of mind are you? What state of mind did you begin in? And what state of mind will you end up in? Now, there are many, many devices in the scripture that are directly at the reader. And I can't mention them all, the rhetorical devices, but they're trying in some way to transmit this transcendent state of wisdom to the readers, even beyond your understanding. And this encoded dialogue that I described is just one of them, but as I mentioned before, there's wordplay, puns and verbal pivots on words with double meanings. It's not for comedy's sake, right? It's not for comedy, though you might find yourself smiling at times. There's a couple points where some just, all-out laughter is really welcome. But what it's aimed at is teaching us it's making us, let's say, transcend our limited understandings, and is trying to point towards the ineffable non-duality. So humor is usually something going this direction, and then there's a pause and it derails and goes that direction. And then afterwards you realize, oh, this thing and that thing, how they fit together, and humor comes. This is seeing the non-dual. Seeing the non-dual after you get the punchline, so to speak. The non-dual is being transmitted if we look for it. So one of the other ones, I hope, by the way, you get some of these jokes. I've done my best to translate them, but I think we started there by saying it's not really that easy. And Sanskrit jokes, I don't know. There's a lot of playing on words and clever things, and, sometimes you might think, okay. But if you really listen to them, there's a kind of a lightness, there's a sort of a non-fixed quality in them that runs counter to what Shariputra wants out of words. You see? Shariputra wants out of these words something very fixed, very tight, some conceptual understanding. There's a whole section where Shariputra has kind of gotten along pretty well, and he's starting to understand. He tries to say it, but everything he says comes out wrong. And Subhuti is kind of going, and they go back and forth, and it plays like Who's On First, if you know this old comedy gag, right? Who's on first? Yes, right? Plays a bit like that. And in the text itself, they stop giving you the names of who says what. It just says aha, aha, which means he says, he says, he says, he says. Up until that point, they're constantly telling you who says what. But you can't deny that they're doing this with the explicit purpose of communicating to you this very confusing interchange between these two views. And Shariputra is getting more and more desperate to pin him down. And at the end, he says, well, this is not illuminating at all. And then, with a smile, we can imagine, Subhuti says, it's very illuminating. You see? So there's humor here, and we can't always translate all that. And if you don't study the text, and if you don't know all the things, you won't see the jokes, and you won't see the echoes and the reverberations for meanings that have come down to you in other forms. If you know the Abhidharma quite well, and you read this text, it's a lot easier. If you know Abhidharma, Shravaka view quite well, and if you have some understanding of emptiness, not that hard to understand what's going on. But most of us don't know the old Abhidharma, the particular Abhidharma that they were dealing with and the assumptions that were there. So sometimes you are not given the background to understand what is underpinning this conversation and what the confusion is. And so that's where we will get confused when we read this text. And that's what the Abhisamayalankara does. It takes these different sort of Abhidharmic points and it shows you not only what the underpinning of that section is about, supposed to be about, not always that clear, but on top of that, it shows you how the Mahāyāna is transcending that, going further. So it's very comparative. The entire text is comparative. Even when it's explained, it's all about the comparative. This is what the Abhidharma view is, and this is how the Mahāyāna goes further. In other words, transcendent state doesn't just land on that fixed state in that island. It's very active and mobile. It moves from meditation to post-meditation, back and forth, until it achieves the ultimate transcendence, that absolute transcendent state of wisdom possessed by a Buddha, which is the floating. So the conversation about how to go about life in this transcendent state includes, of course, all the practices of the Bodhisattva, the transcendent generosity, which again, this word transcendent gives us an idea of all of those. Generosity in this text is transcendent only because one sees through the identity of a giver, a gift, and a recipient. So you have to transcend any notion of identity, but go out and practice giving. So the transcendent generosity, which is informed by this transcendent state of wisdom, is a practice. That's what you're doing in the ocean as the lifeguard. You're doing all these practices in that purified worldly awareness. Purified because you're not sinking in the ocean. You're not going back into samsara. You're swimming like an expert swimmer in that ocean. And you're trying to carry out these practices, and you're doing so for the benefit of all sentient beings. But more specifically, to attain the state of a Buddha so that you can help them in the way that a Buddha can, from the non-dual awareness. It's not easy to describe all the benefits of the performative approach. I've basically tried to give you a feel for the wonderful things in this text, and if you have this in your mind, it may help you appreciate it, but my own experience of trying to chant things, recite them aloud very fast, doesn't really give you time to stop and smell the daisies. And the story of the Tibetan tradition, dividing the text up into pieces and everybody resounding it, there's not a whole lot of understanding that's implied. But since you'll be going from beginning to end, I thought it would be helpful to have some idea of what's going on. There are other passages, for instance, just to give some headliners of other things to look for. There's one chapter where virtually the same exact words are repeated over a page long, is repeated over and over again, and just a word or two in the middle are changed. Try copy editing that. Try copy editing that, right? I tried, and I had all my methods, highlighting and trying to figure out. So each time it goes through this, it's building. It's building. It's not just saying the same thing. It's 1,000-fold universe, 2,000-fold, 3,000. Each time it's getting bigger. And Khonsa, when he did his translation, just eliminated the entire chapter and said one page, and then he put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all in one. which is a shame because the entire point, I don't know, I can't say the point, because there's more than one point, but one of the points for sure in reciting this is performative. It is what it does to you to recite this over and over. What it does to you, what it does to your conceptual mind. And also, there's two aspects of that performativity. It's not just you're saying the same thing over and over, which would have one effect of sort of wearing out your conceptual mind, but it's increasing in number and it's increasing in metaphor, and it's going up and up and up to astronomical, inconceivable levels. Understand? So it's trying to kind of actually on the spot to some extent. Now, I've been speaking about this as a wonderful piece of literature almost, and I'm not meaning to say this is not the way it actually happened. It's just brilliantly manifest in this manner, and we can appreciate it for what it is. And we can talk about it in these terms, and that can help us to read through it and have more appreciation for what we're reading through. But whatever you see, there's so many different devices in this sutra. That's just one chapter doing that. Each chapter has a different word play. If you read the introduction to the translation, there's a section where I summarize different words that are being played on. I only included the major word plays. There's smaller ones too. All the time something is going on that will move your mind outside of its usual conceptual attempt to nail things down into this space. So the performative level of this sutra is to let it wash over you, to do all of this repetition and also do it wholeheartedly with devotion, and to let that destroy, to some extent, the clinging to identity that Venerable so lovely made such lovely comments about. When you're talking about this big, big, big universe, this billion-fold universe, this trillion-fold universe, and this vast scale, is very humbling. Suddenly this I that is the center of the universe doesn't seem so big anymore. So understand that, yes, we are doing the recitation of this sutra as a resounding or a resounding for its magical, wonderful qualities that it has. Benefits for ourselves and others in this very abstract way. But certainly this scripture was intended to be recited over and over like maybe you could say a very long sadhana, a Tibetan sadhana, over and over, as a way of engaging directly with the transcendent state of wisdom through this performativity. In other words, it offers a profound method for meeting the mind of the Buddha. Profound method for meeting this mind of the Buddha. And if you don't ever end up studying the ornament of clear realization and learning all the inside jokes and the comparative, there is a tradition that says you can get there, you can get pretty darn close without ever even having to lift that book. Now, I'm not saying don't study, okay, because I'll get in trouble. If you can, you should study. But within the text itself, there's one thing that it says, which is a very interesting other self-referential moment in the text, where it says, Shrenika. Shrenika was a wandering ascetic. Shrenika heard just one verse of this, referring to itself. Shrenika heard one verse of this and immediately went into a very high level of samadhi and experience of emptiness. Now the commentators tell us which level of emptiness was he. It was a pretty good one. For those who really want to know, it's somewhere on the path of preliminary practice, known as the Jorlam. Sometimes people call it path of junction. I'm not sure what translations you use around here. We'll change those. But the path of preliminary practice is right before the becoming a noble one. And so they say that just from one verse, just from hearing one verse, with total devotion, Sranika became on the level of patience, the patient acceptance, which is the kind of downhill, the sort of easy downhill. You've got a direct experience of emptiness, and it will eventually, on its own, result in what they say the path of seeing, or the moment of liberating insight at the path of seeing, where you see emptiness directly for yourself without any conceptuality. So the power of reciting this or understanding this is supposed to depend on devotion. I don't have that kind of devotion, so I had to read and study and do a lot of things, and I'm still a long way off. But many of you who are going to be reciting this, knowing of this tradition, could definitely, I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised. Such devoted people. Okay, maybe you need more than one verse. But it's out there. It's out there. And then finally, I'll just mention that the final 3 chapters of this, you almost want them to be the first 3 chapters, because they tell the story of Sada Praradita, who is, I believe we translate it as ever weeping. Is it ever weeping in here? What's that? Oh, we left it in the Sanskrit. Yeah, I haven't seen the most recently copy-edited form, and there are some changes that I'm not aware of. But the ever weeping is Sada means always or ever weeping. And the story of ever weeping, if you don't know it, is an incredible story. I don't know how anybody hears that story and doesn't weep themselves. It's just like a bone crusher. You can't walk out of there alive. Really good story of somebody giving his whole heart, his whole body to receive this text, not even to get teachings on it, just to receive the text. Very inspiring story about how to go about approaching this and the kind of devotion that this tradition is asking for. And if you know this is the background, I'm telling you ahead, because when you get there, I think there are reasons for that being at the end, the Sada Praradita. Some people think it was originally a separate thing and it was attached, a separate sutra that was attached at the end of the 8,000. And so it then became part of the 8,000. And that makes a lot of sense. It's a very different tone. It's talking very differently than the rest of the sutra. And this was a tradition where you'd combine different texts together in your sadhana, in your very specific practice. But there is another reason I think that it works well at the end. I'm telling you ahead that it's a crazy story about somebody really striving with all their heart and mind. But once you get there, if you've been reciting, I think you're open in a way that you weren't before. Okay? So there's incredible performative devices in this sutra to work on us at multiple levels. We can't just sit here and talk about it all day because we've got to get to reciting tomorrow. But I want to invite everybody to participate in this recitation with some background and some appreciation for these things, just enough to make it a little bit more interesting when you translate instead of just taking a page and reciting it. All right. Thank you very much to everybody. I also would like to thank the editor, John Canty, and Charles Hastings, who edited, and Kunchok Norbu, who did the copy editing, and an amazing job of inspiring everybody to come here. I think this is just a huge bodhisattva activity, to tell you the truth. Who would have thunk, that this could be something that did it? And then Venerable Thupten Chodron for being crazy enough to say, yes, let's do it. Okay, thank you all.